This is it. The apocalypse. The air is toxic. The food is toxic. The people are toxic. And culture stopped in the 1950s. But at least we have video games. And today, we'll be looking at Fallout 4. But luckily, Fallout 4 is a very upbeat game for a setting which features a world ravaged by nuclear catastrophe and a main protagonist who has lost his spouse and is in a frantic pursuit for his lost son who may not even be alive. But hey, you know what? That's okay. Because, as the song goes, they call me the Wanderer. And sometimes they call the cops. But they never call me back. Except to threaten to press charges. Yo, it's pronounced Crichton. Let's talk Fallout 4. Visually the game is decent, but it can be a bit hit or miss from time to time. And by time to time, I mean most of the time. It usually looks okay, and at times it can look great, but sometimes it is that. The visual quality is a cluster of acceptable, nice, pretty good, and does that wall even have a normal map? I actually have the visual experience summed up in one clip. So here you see a messy place with a broken window and a rusted desk. You can tell that something bad has happened to this place and it hasn't been fixed in a long time. At this point the graphics are serviceable. Then you turn and you see an excellently designed and well-animated dog model with decent textures. It looks authentic but also cartoony enough to be charming. At this point the graphics are great. And then you turn around and... Where I come from, such graphics are eloquently described as... To get a bit more serious though, the first visual aspect that greets you when you start playing is also the game's strongest side, visually speaking, and that is its ambient, which is superb. The god rays, fog, and lighting make up for a very atmospheric experience, to the point where it is enjoyable to just walk around the wasteland and observe how immersive it gets. And I've said it before, an action game that can get you sightseeing is a good-looking game. You will also notice that Fallout 4 does away with the set color filters of previous titles. Fallout 3 and New Vegas had a tint to their atmosphere that was supposed to convey the underlying setting, namely Fallout 3 was toxically green and New Vegas was scorchingly orange. And while it did serve its purpose, this kind of imposing of the ambient had a negative impact on the color palette in that it made for a bland visual experience in the long run. Fallout 4 is a straight upgrade to its predecessors in this regard. It does not do away with the filter itself, but instead it tries to adjust its color to fit the setting. And so, when you get to a heavily irradiated zone, you will notice the sky turning green, adapting an ominous, polluted look. But when you find yourself in a warm environment, you will notice the fog adapting the orange tint of the rising or the setting sun. And it looks amazing. It feels authentic and creative at the same time, and it can be very immersive. When you're not in any particular setting, the ambient is a foggy white, and this can be a double-edged sword. At times it feels cold and alienating, as it should, but at other times it just makes the game look washed out. It is an unnecessary obscuring of the draw distance and, ironically, a hidden performance. The good news is that more often than not, it gets the look right. It lets you know that this is not a cheery, welcoming place, so I think that it serves its purpose well. But if you still don't like it, you can also turn it off, and you won't have to deal with fog ever again. Unless John Carpenter has his way. So the ambient is great, to settle that. But what about the technical side? What about the models, the animations, the textures? Yeah, what about the textures? The best I could call it is inconsistent. The models are nice and faces look okay, but the animation leaves much to be desired. Not just in the sense of smoothness of motion, which is not too bad, but in the limitation of animated actions that NPCs can perform. Not only are they bereft of detail, they also lack essential actions such as NPCs reacting to being shot. There's only blood splatter that does not actually splatter anything, and if you're lucky, a flinch. In 2002, Medal of Honor did this. The lack of animations in Fallout 4 cannot be justified under any premise. A lot of the textures are last-gen quality, and some of them are really last-gen. And that's just one generation behind, mind you. Compared to contemporary competition, namely Metal Gear Solid 5 and The Witcher 3, Fallout 4 is seriously lacking. If you're bothered by visual flaws that reek of either carelessness, rushing, or severe underqualification on the developer's parts, vanilla Fallout 4 may be something you'd want to skip on visual grounds alone. Luckily, there are plenty of mods that fix this, and again, the game looks well enough as a whole, and that is mainly due to its superb ambient. I would conclude this section by saying that despite its graphics being objectively inferior to contemporary AAA titles, I still think that it looks decent. It is like a 5 out of 10 with a great personality. And that's what it comes down to. Fallout 4 may be visually lacking in many aspects, but it excels in style and atmosphere. If you value the latter, you're in for a great visual experience, and you can mod the rest until it suits your taste. So while I can't call Fallout 4 a visual benchmark for its generation, I advise not to ignore the stellar forest just because of a few ugly trees. Literally. Okay, so, the natural follow-up to graphics is performance. It can justify simplistic visuals, and it can nullify great visuals. So how does Fallout 4 run? Well, the answer is, once again, inconsistently. Running on a 7th Gen i5 and a 6GB 1060 at 1080 resolution and mostly maxed out, the game ran at a very smooth 60 frames per second, no matter what was happening on screen. That is, unless I stepped outside during the day, at which point the game ran like a blocked nose, and that simile goes far. In the general wasteland it could fluctuate between 45 and 60, and in urban areas it could drop down to 22. From what I've gathered, part of the problem lies in the way that the engine handles certain things, most noticeably its reliance on the CPU for rendering shadows, which is a huge burden for mid-range CPUs. It also allegedly renders things in a radius as opposed to what the player can see, so it is a resource hog that clogs your system with unnecessary information alongside information that is best relegated to the GPU. And that is likely just the tip of the iceberg. I've experienced serious framerate drops where both my CPU and the GPU were actually being underutilized, which most likely points to a software bottleneck as opposed to struggling hardware. Now, the silver lining is that this really only concerns people who want to get the full visual experience out of the game. If you lower down eye candy like God rays, shadows, and HBO+, the net gain in frames should more than make up for the previous stutters, considering that these settings cost about 5 frames each. Personally, I would recommend keeping the settings as high as your hardware allows you to, because a product that opts for immersion usually relies on the visuals to achieve this end. You'll be doing a lot of walking and sightseeing, so it is probably better that the game looks good than it is for it to run smoothly. But that is just my opinion. If you prefer smooth motion, you can go for the high preset instead of ultra, and your experience will be much smoother than mine. Now, what I do recommend that anybody who plays this on the PC does is to edit the shadow distance in the INI file. As you can see, the difference between medium and high makes no sense when compared to the interval between high and ultra, so you should try and find something in between. This will result in a noticeable boost in performance without an actually noticeable drop in quality. And speaking of editing INI files, provided you're willing to tinker with the settings and look into performance mods, you can achieve some great quality to performance balancing, including getting the game to run on hardware for which it was not even predicted. In conclusion, while the visuals of Fallout 4 cannot justify its performance, nor can the performance justify its stated looks, the game itself is playable across a range of different hardware specifications, and it can be tweaked to whichever end of the looks and performance spectrum you might prefer, which is pretty good for a Bethesda game. And speaking of Bethesda, Fallout 4 is surprisingly stable. I invested somewhere between 200 and 300 hours into it, modding included, and got only a handful of crashes. Yes, there are visual glitches, some quests can break, and you do get stuck in geometry every now and then, but nothing that can't be fixed with simple console commands. So much so that I don't see the need to recommend any unofficial patches. The only thing you should do is to edit the INI files, again, to adjust the field of vision and to disable mouse acceleration, provided you care for such things. And if you're playing this on the PC, you most likely do. Compared to Fallout 3 and New Vegas, Fallout 4 is incredibly stable. Compared to Skyrim, it is incredibly unoptimized. But compared to what we've come to expect from Bethesda, it just works. So we've covered graphics, we've talked performance, and now it is time to discuss the art style. And since a game like this depends heavily on visual storytelling, we will look into the narrative as well. And that's convenient because both the narrative and the style have similar strengths and the same underlying flaw. Now the major upside is that they get the job done. They present the player with a post-apocalyptic scenario in a world that is fittingly post-apocalyptic. Both raise some interesting points that could be developed further and both have their unique moments. The major downside, however, is that the art style and the writing alike suffer from a serious lack of identity. In the writing, this is reflected as inconsistency, both narrative and stylistic, whereas the design choices of the visual presentation show this flaw as what can best be described as creative insecurity. To elaborate on the latter, the idea is that Fallout 4 does not seem to know whether it wants to present the universe of Fallout or if it would rather present a generic wasteland with the Fallout license instead. Some have complained that the design shows a wasteland too dilapidated for what Fallout ought to aim to present, namely that the wasteland looks too ruinous and too dirty for a world that has had 200 years to recover. But that is mostly misconception. I can certainly agree to an extent, but it can be explained in that there is no reason to assume that the nuclear bombs have been the only devastating event to have taken place. Rebuilding takes a back seat when surviving an armed anarchy with a radioactive spin, and for what it's worth, there are instances that show that civilization has very clearly taken tremendous steps to reclaiming what was initially lost. So while it is true that the world building definitely does suffer from being but a generic wasteland for the most part, I would advise not to ignore the good for the sake of bashing the bad. There are things here that make sense to both the setting and the way that the player gets to interact with this world. With that said, the problem with the world building lies in the nature of Fallout 4's role as an iteration of Fallout for a modern audience, in which, much like its modern audience, it doesn't seem to know what it wants to achieve. Take the gore for example. On the one hand, I am satisfied that the game has its own gore system. It may not be perfect, but it is still more than what most games have, and it is commendable in that right alone. But on the other hand, when it tries to use gore as an effect, it fails in its purpose. At some point, you will come across a place that looks as if the Reavers from Firefly have had their way with it, and you will probably also notice that it is to no effect. For all its detail, it suffers from a serious lack of detail. It is supposed to be extremely gory and gross and unpleasant to look at, but it does not look like a horror element. It just looks like any other element. Another example is the redesign of the ghouls. These are people whose mutation has been to live in a state of constant bodily decay. The moment their brains rot enough, they become feral. The game tries to make it explicitly clear that the ghouls are not actually zombies. You see that? Often mistaken for zombies, but not actually zombies. Except that they look like zombies, they behave like the undead, and they like to hang around graveyards. Hi, not zombies. It is I, the not unsociable person. How are you doing in this not violent day? So they're a unique class implying a deep lore in the loading text, and generic elements in a generic post-apocalyptic setting in every other part of the game. There is inconsistency between what the game presents and what the game thinks it ought to present. This is also reflected in the retrofuturism, which is one of the most recognizable aesthetic aspects of the series. Fallout 4 carries on the tradition of presenting a fictional world that looks like what a person in the 1950s would have imagined the future to be like. It also seems to understand that Fallout is an amalgam of the trends of the 90s and the 50s. Now, unfortunately, it does not seem to realize that these trends should make sense, so it only partially gets it right. I rather like the design of the combat rifle, which looks like a futuristic Browning automatic rifle, or the assault rifle, which somewhat resembles modern experimental weapons. So in this regard it works well. But then you get a Thompson submachine gun. It is not a high-tech variant of the Thompson, nor is it a unique item. This is very clearly a forced decision for the sake of capturing the gangster vibe. Now this poses the question, could we at least explain these design choices? And the answer is yes. The Commonwealth is abundant in museums and cultural remnants that could easily account for the trends shown in the game world. For instance, the ideologues who want to unify the Commonwealth have taken to associating themselves with the historical Minutemen, and the organized underworld found appeal in gangster cliches. It makes sense to be so, but the game does not care to explain how this came about. In fact, they just speculated much more than the game has cared to explain to the player. While Fallout 4 is certainly not lacking in lore in the general sense, it unfortunately lacks lore where it matters the most, and that is in linking the visual design to the underlying story. And for this reason, everything in it comes off as contrived for the sake of building the world around Boston stereotypes. Whereas New Vegas introduced Western, rock and roll, and Vegas stereotypes, it cared to explain why this was the case, so it felt natural. But Fallout 4, in lacking this kind of an explanation, suffers in that it feels either artificial or needlessly cartoony.
I like my version better.
And this sense of not knowing what the design is trying to communicate is also present in the music selection. Now, Fallout 4 gets the music right to some extent. Every Fallout game, starting with Fallout 3, has had its own iconic songs, and Fallout 4 is no exception, especially as this time around it has a larger selection and more thought seems to have been put into it. So some of it is well thought out. There's a bit of music written for the game alone that mentions the Great War and in-game locations and makes use of some Fallout jargon, and this is a nice touch and a piece of evidence that the world is slowly moving on. There's some sense of a culture being developed and a foundation of what had been the pre-war trend, and these are great. Everyone involved in this decision deserves a good share of praise for the work they've done.
I'm a little short of caps, but I'm a good neighbor.
Another notable selection is a string of songs that are unified in the theme of a naive outlook on radiation. These are real-world songs from the mid-20th century that sing about such things as an atom bomb baby, uranium fever, and Sheldon Allman kissing radiation burns away. In the context of the game, it is very fitting that what was considered to be a source of nigh omnipotence has been the cause of total destruction. It makes you wonder if it might be alluding to some real-world parallel. This part of the selection is commendable. And just as commendable is the inclusion of The End of the World by Skeeter Davis. This is a great song by its musical value alone. It has a pleasant melody and hauntingly beautiful vocals, and Fallout 4's embellishment is in that the context allows for a unique and touching ambiguity in the lyrics. It is the perfect song for lamenting a lover, exploring a fallen civilization, or lamenting a lover in a fallen civilization, while reviewing a game. However, the rest of the music is, for the most part, just songs thrown in without a continuous theme. Some are okay, but plenty are unfortunately annoying from the get-go.
Girls! Girls! Watch out! Watch out!
And the in-game radio will not spare you the repetition. Listening to Roy Brown bragging for the 10,000th time drops the music rating by a full letter grade. Hey everybody, did the news get around about a guy named Butcher Pete? Oh, Pete just flew into this town and he's chopping up all the women's meat. Wow. John Donne, get off your throne. We have a new metaphysical poet in town. Now look, it is not that one ought to expect poetic quality in every song, but there is a difference between lyrics that are not to be taken seriously and lyrics that are just plain bad. Tongue-in-cheek sex humor can be witty if you can pull it out, but you must never force it. The impression I get from Fallout 4's Wink Wink songs is that the target demographic has been offensively misjudged, so much so that I don't actually know for whom this specific selection has been intended. The real problem is that the good songs raise your standard for what to expect, and then they get drowned out in a collection of music that appears as if Johnny Guitar from New Vegas spawned half a dozen illegitimate offspring.
It's a man.
And you'll notice that most of the criticism I have for the game is precisely the fact that it lacks identity. It does not know if it appeals to Fallout fans, Bethesda fans, or some hypothetical demographic they're trying to reach after having researched what their fellow kids are into these days. The writing suffers from a similar identity crisis, and so much so that it is the weakest part of the game.
I swear I'm not a synth. Don't shoot, for God's sakes, we're family!
Put the gun down, now!
He's a synth! He'll kill us all! Kyle, no!
Okay, show's over. There are no synths in Diamond City, hear me?
In post-apocalyptic America, human interactions have mutated into bad high school plays. Setting the game to The Wanderer by Dion would imply an upbeat, boundless narrative, but the game opens to a grim premise and an even grimmer turn of events, all in a plot so constrained that the player can neither speculate about their character's past, nor can they seriously alter the future. The story is incredibly inconsistent. Considering the dismal premise, you'd think it wants to be taken seriously, but it takes so many wrong turns that it comes off as either a parody of such a narrative or a placeholder for one. The writing is heavily packed with an amalgam of clumsy ad hoc contrivances carelessly thrown over plot holes so big that they should have known to scrap this idea early on. The plot is something like a mix between Andromeda and Finding Nemo, and avoiding spoilers, that is actually incredibly accurate. The player character and his role in this world is not only a fish out of water, but they're also a fish out of water in a History Channel at midnight kind of way. The story also has a side narrative, as you have already seen, concerning synths, or androids who try to integrate into society. And there is a political side plot as well, in that 4 factions fight for control over the Commonwealth. But this way, you might think that such a layout would make for an excellent story, and you would be right in thinking so, but you would be wrong to assume that it does. The plot and the philosophical aspects are just a bare-bones storyline with a black and white system of right and wrong. There's very little to think about concerning the moral values of each faction. In fact, if you try to think about them, you will notice that 2 of these factions make no sense to exist in the first place. You will not find the great politics of New Vegas, or even the loose moral choices that were present in Skyrim. It does not even offer a sense of urgency or mystery as did Fallout 3. The writing is just too lacking to make for a setting where anything feels like it matters. The narrative of Fallout 4 is not written as a living world, but as a placeholder for a world. The only thing the main story has going for it is that it introduces the player to some interesting sequences and locations, but these are few and far between. Apart from that, Fallout 4 does not satisfy any standard of good storytelling. And the real tragedy is that there actually are instances of good writing, intriguing, creative, and fittingly serious or humorous depending on the setting. This comes to attention during some of the side quests, especially ones related to specific locations and characters. And some of these could have served as very competent storylines, if not even substituted the main plotline if given the right kind of attention. However, the narrative in Fallout 4 shows but glimpses of talent, drowned out in an overall bad narrative and curtailed by lack of development where it should have been focused in abundance. It has lost potential at the best of times and an utter disappointment at the worst of times. Considering that the appeal of Fallout is the world with which the player can interact and the fact that the writing is what shapes this world and the nature of the interactions, this comes as a huge detriment to the overall experience one can have in the game. Yet despite of all these flaws, Fallout 4 is still incredibly immersive, even if not consistently engaging. The ruinous state of the setting looks convincing, sci-fi elements look authentic, and there is enough visual variety to appease the eyes and encourage exploration. And the more you explore, the more you discover the true value of the game. The design may not be perfect, but there are memorable scenes and characters, even if most of them are restrained to side quests. And nothing beats those rare but precious instances of well-placed detail, like coming across preservation shelters which turn out to have been ineffective, and finding out that one of them contains only toys. And I'm not gonna give away the Lovecraftian one. So while some of the design choices are debatable, to say the least, and some are outright bad, most noticeably the writing, which has no redeeming qualities, there are instances of the game getting things right and keeping them just right enough to hold on to that piece of charm inherent to its niche, that post-apocalyptic mock sci-fi semi-serious, yes the world has ended but I happen to be into that what of it mentality, for which we play these games. Well, I don't think that it just works is a valid argument, at least not in regards to the writing. The developers have done a very decent job of creating a world that will no doubt appeal to those of us who have an appeal for an apocalypse less metaphorical in our social lives.
Scared, huh?
Yeah, very scared. Extremely so. You know what? Actually, I see your point. I see your point. Hey, who am I kidding? I'm like level 40. I'm the death one now. Yeah, I get looted. For the most part, the gameplay consists of 3 major elements: movement, combat, and looting. You sprint until your stamina runs out, and then you walk until it recharges so you can sprint again, unless you're over encumbered. You occasionally stop to click on things until they die, and you interrupt this to check for items you can put in your professional hoarder portfolio, and every now and then you level up. That is the gist of it, but there is a lot more to be said. Major open world games contemporary to Fallout 4 all showed awareness that there ought to be some standard in designing convenient mechanics by which the player traverses the map. Games released 2014 and on saw the wide-scale introduction of gyrocopters, mounts, grappling hooks, and even parkour. And consequently, getting from point A to point B has been much more enjoyable in these titles than it has been in their predecessors. It went from being a chore to being entertaining in its own right. Fallout 4, I am pleased to say, follows this trend. Now, it does not actually add vehicles. A driving mechanic would not be compatible with the terrain. Instead, it makes subtle alterations to the movement mechanics and the design of the open world that account for the ability to traverse large areas at an unnoticeably fast pace. In addition to the sprint function, the default player movement speed is just fast enough to allow for quick movement while still feeling natural. Be it on the ground or in water, the player moves at a fast jog. This goes hand in hand with the fact that the map has been designed in a way that cuts down on pointless wandering. While the wasteland still has its open, desolate areas, they are strategically placed and reasonably spaced out, and consequently points of interest are much closer together because the space between them has been reduced, so movement feels even swifter, and there are things to explore and numerous encounters, quite literally, around every corner. The interaction between the terrain and player movement mechanics has been exceptionally well executed. At times it can feel a bit floaty, especially when you notice the unnatural jumping distance, but that too is designed to allow the player to more easily interact with the verticality of the maps. And that is another thing the game takes into account. While low-gravity caves and working elevators may not make perfect sense in the world-building aspect, in the gameplay the design is very convenient. And if that's not enough, the game features a jetpack upgrade for the power armor. And on top of that, 2 of the game's factions allow for a canonized fast travel system, similar to the ones in GTA and Far Cry 2. I have to say I was very pleasantly surprised that Fallout 4 did not suffer from the chore of traversing large empty areas of the map, which is the detriment of many open world titles, including its predecessors. It finds a more or less perfect balance between packed and desolate, so the world feels neither claustrophobic nor empty. Movement from point A to point B is swift, and there is always something interesting to discover along the way, which is more than I can say about the combat. On the one hand, Fallout 4 has the best gunplay I've seen in a Bethesda RPG. On the other hand, the bar for that is so low, Todd Howard can bump his head on it. RPG elements still impose too much on the combat, so your performance for the most part is entirely contingent on your stats. Enemies will survive multiple headshots, and they won't even flinch unless crippled. It is not as bad as it was in Fallout 3, but bullet sponges are still the norm early game. Conversely, once you have leveled up enough, well, see for yourselves. Late game, there is no challenge. The player becomes virtually immortal. This is perhaps the worst offender in a vanilla game once you get to about level 40. Early game is okay, provided you can tolerate random, cheap explosions.
Who minds their own base?
And raiders do spawn with Fat Man. VATS makes a comeback from previous titles, and for players who use mouse and keyboard it is just as obsolete. Whereas the shooting itself is fine, the melee mechanics are not. The entirety of the melee system is clicking at point blank and a very rudimentary block mechanic. It is not very fun, and considering there are enemies who will shoot at you from inaccessible places, it is clearly a suboptimal build. This is peculiarly lazy considering that there were ranged enemies in Skyrim as well, but they never invalidated melee builds. The simple addition of shields could have solved this issue. Vanilla, its only upside is the real-time gore. There's also the bare-bones stealth system, inspired by Eastern European meditation. It is uninventive at the best of times. The AI is average at best, and in this era that is an umbrella term for bad but acceptable for lack of choice. Put this way, the gist of the combat is that it is uninspired and dull. But that is not the full picture. I don't mean to make the entirety of the combat sound like a failure. Firefights are still fun, raiders are a typical armed enemy, and killing them is not something you're likely to pass on. They even have a rescan called the Gunners, and fights break out frequently. Going up against super mutants will have you dodging mutant hounds and suicide bombers as well. And the new attack patterns of the ghouls, while nonsensical in regards to their lore, make them pose a foreboding threat to the sole survivor. There's a variety of bugs with unique attacks, ranging from annoying to genuinely dangerous. And robots are not limited to clunky police bots. There's a decent variety of things you get to fight, in aesthetics and method alike. While they may not stand out compared to the enemy variety of Doom or the versatility of Rage, the enemies in Fallout 4 outclass those of many other titles in how diverse they are. Some are the default hit scanners, varying in health and damage output. Some will have you dodging projectiles, others will have you timing your attacks, and the threat level of some will depend on specific equipment. This is further complemented by the variety of the weapons, of which there are plenty, and their stats are such that most of them are entirely viable on their own if you prefer a survival playstyle and carry only one or two. But if you want a more shooter-like experience and your carrying capacity allows you to, you can carry as many as you please. There are two things the combat in Fallout 4 gets just right. One is the expression of a fantasy post-apocalypse with a diverse selection of combatants. Between humans, animals, and various mutations of the two, it ticks all the right boxes for what you might expect to encounter in the wasteland, plus military-grade robots. The second thing it gets right is the freedom the player has in their character's weapons of choice. The Western gunslinger, the special operative, the sci-fi soldier, the modern samurai, you name it. If your character's preferred arsenal has been depicted in a similar setting, Fallout 4 allows you to play it out. And by some lucky chance that also just works, the aforementioned clunkiness of the system can sometimes actually contribute to the sense that the game world is not in mint condition. These are old guns with aged gunpowder and makeshift upgrades, used by wild people. They're not supposed to feel smooth. So while it is very obviously flawed, it is serviceable, and provided you are on the PC, there are mod fixes that address most of the issues. The major hindrance to the combat experience is actually something not directly related to the combat system itself, but rather the breaks in pacing that happen as a result of looting, and it is an issue inherent to all Fallout games. This is not Far Cry or Rage, where searching crates and bodies gives you $5 in pocket lint. In Fallout, it is your primary means of getting resources. So unless you feel like backtracking entire areas, you will most likely find yourself ignoring an ongoing battle for the sake of scavenging. Those enraged raiders will have to wait, because hostages are expendable. Duct tape is not. Truth be told, it might have been a good idea to allow the player to automatically pick up ammunition and healing items, but as it stands, it is one of those things that you either don't mind or you learn to tolerate. Now the good news is that the mechanic itself is fine. This time around it happens real time, so it is not an absolute halt in the action as it was in previous games, although you can do that too. So it is smoother and a bit riskier than it used to be. Inventory management, while annoying, is no worse than it has been in previous titles. It is also convenient that you can access up to 12 selected items with the number keys. That should be enough to cover what you use as opposed to what you hoard. And speaking of hoarding, this time around the junk category actually has its use. This happens with the breaking down of elements that constitute the various types of junk into various resources. And these matter in the game's well-designed crafting system. Whereas weapons crafting was an entirely optional and often ignored point of Fallout 3 and New Vegas, Fallout 4's crafting system is something that you are very likely to use for both its viability in the gameplay as well as convenience. It is simple and it is intuitive, and it allows for modular weapon design with plenty of upgrades to choose from. Silencers and scopes and upgrades to the builder are given, but in addition to these, it is also possible to convert one weapon type into a different category altogether. For example, an assault rifle can be altered to function as a submachine gun with a shorter barrel and a hair trigger. Conversely, you can increase its accuracy and give it a scope and have yourself a sniper rifle. You can also select things like ammo types and arbitrary things like skins. Above all, you can give your guns cringy names that you thought sounded funny at the time. Granted, the modular weapon design is not up to par with the weapons modification of the Metro games, and it does not quite measure up to the blacksmithing and enchanting skills of Skyrim, but it is an improvement over previous Fallout releases, and it offers a number of options to accommodate your playstyle. In addition to guns, you can also upgrade and improve your armor and power armor, which works pretty much in the same way, and they give you some additional perks as well. And this talk of emphasis in crafting leads us to one of the game's major advertised selling points, which is the building of settlements. It is perhaps the most unique contribution of Fallout 4 to the series. Whereas previous games try to have the player feel like their decisions mattered by having NPCs react to their reputation, Fallout 4 says, hey, you want to have an impact in this world? How about you build it yourself? And somehow they made that marketable. And despite it being clunky at times, which is the equivalent of saying despite it being a Bethesda release, it is actually a fairly well-developed system. and you can invest in it as much or as little as you like. If you don't want it, you don't have to use it at all. If you're only in it for the Minutemen faction, you can limit your investment to a water pump, a plant, a bed, and a turret. And if you find it fun, you can build some very impressive things with it. I only got into the building during the late game, and I actually found it rather enjoyable, and I don't usually do that. Some people have complained that it is unrewarding in that, apart from creating personalized checkpoints, the settlement system does not have an actual impact in the game. And this criticism is valid. It is definitely underutilized. It would have been so much better if each of the settlements you found had a certain event trigger at some specific milestone for that specific settlement. This could have definitely had more to it in that regard. As it stands, the settlements don't really do anything apart from some resource acquisition and very minor events such as random attacks and annoying Radiant quests, with the Radiant quests making no sense whatsoever. As you can see from the map, my settlers from this location complain about trouble from this location. Look, if somebody travels across the map just to bully you, you might want to be a bit more introspective about it. It really is a missed opportunity that it had to be this underdeveloped, with the settlements being a feature that makes up for the ruinous state of the wasteland and that the player is the one who gets to make the necessary changes. Their lack of narrative impact really hinders what could have otherwise been a Game of the Year design choice. So on the surface it is fun and clunky. In regards to the mechanics, it is mostly useless. In fact, it is predominantly useless. But the more nihilistic you want to get, the more things become useless. So the fact of the matter is that it can be a fun mechanic, and since gaming is an entertainment medium, I think that it does its purpose well enough. And this is another aspect that is often overlooked. People complain about the game lacking role-playing elements, and that is an absolutely valid point. However, for all its flaws, playing as the person who sets out to rebuild civilization and being able to literally build things according to your taste is a rather unique step in regards to putting your own character into the game world. With that said though, complaints about Fallout 4's RPG elements or lack thereof are absolutely spot on, so much so that it is virtually impossible to classify Fallout 4 as a role-playing game. You start out by choosing one of two characters, a husband who is a war veteran or a wife who has a degree in law. Now this would be okay if these backstories actually correlated to the relevant stats, but in reality the waifu is as good at wielding a minigun as the husbando is at conducting speeches, so the limitation in player lore is useless. Worse still is the fact that no matter how you want to play, the game forces you into the good guy warrior archetype. There is no way to play as the villain, nor is there a way past killing everything in your path. The overwhelming majority of your interactions with people in the wasteland will be combat, even with people who otherwise sound like they would be neutral, like the scavengers. You either shoot on sight or you're shot on sight. Charisma and persuasion are still there, but their purpose is down to minuscule conveniences, and badly written ones at that. As is the case with most of the stats. There are only a handful of missions that play out differently if the player character has a specific perk. In Fallout 4 you either fight right away or you talk a bit before you fight, and your role is either that of a cliched cartoon hero or a sarcastic cliched cartoon hero. And this loops back to the extremely restrictive writing. Not only is it bad on its own, but any speculation the player might have about their character is cut down in order to fit the preordained narrative. You will come across pieces of lore that remind you that no, your service in the army was not a mere office boy or a cook or just an average soldier. No, you're a war hero. You also love your spouse and your son, and you are a patriot. Worst of all is the fact that these characters about whom the player character is supposed to care are not developed nearly well enough to make the actual player care. So there is a total disparity between the player and their created character. The developer's vision is shoehorned in a way that replaces the player's imagination. The only way to personalize your character is if you stipulate that the shock of being cryogenically frozen has substantially changed their personality, but even that it is not fully viable.
God damn it, you mercenary motherfucker. Where is my son? Hey there.
And this is where the voice acting comes into play. This is not Mass Effect, where you play as Commander Shepard enacting as Paragon or Renegade Fate, or a Telltale game where you project your decisions onto Big B Wolf. No, this is a Bethesda game, a setting where you are not a set character, but a character that you create on your own. In other words, you are not your character is you, or your imagination thereby. Adding a voice and a delivery to these lines limits the player's ability to create their own character. In the clip I just presented, suppose I want a Clint Eastwood calm type. Perhaps I want an aggressive guy, or maybe a miserable, desperate person. But that decision has been made by Bethesda for me, and while the delivery is usually decent, it is in no way consistently competent.
Ashes, go home. Aaron misses you.
Now on the surface, this does not bother me too much since I am a sworn good guy and I like shooters. So any game where I am the good guy and I get to shoot a lot of people is kind of a paradox, but I like it. But from an objective point of view, this kind of design is a travesty for a game that presents itself as primarily a role-playing game. A past written in stone, a constrained storyline, and virtually no choices in approach or narrative. The horribly designed dialogue system does not help the game either. When selecting a dialogue option, instead of full sentences, the player is given a mere phrase that is only loosely related to what their character is going to say. If you think this leads to ambiguity and confusion some of the time, you're only partially correct. It leads to ambiguity and confusion half of the time, at least. Look at the options of this clip. You'd think that just ascribe implies modesty, namely that my character would say something like, "Thank you, I am honored, but I am but a scribe. It would be presumptuous of me to present myself as the savior of the Brotherhood. I'll do my best, but it would be wrong of me to promise that the effect of my deeds will be fully reflective of my ambition."
I can't recruit. After all I did to help, I was expecting more.
Oh. Well, I guess I'm a douchebag now. This is such a freaking problem that I ended up saving before dialogues just in case my character said something I didn't intend for him to say. And a dialogue system that forces the player into say scumming is not a good dialogue system. It may actually be a new low for dialogue systems. Luckily, there are mods for this, so if you're interested in playing, it is yet another case of bad rap going to Bethesda and praise going to the community.
Sit down and ponder the Almighty in whatever form strikes your fancy.
But not all of the community.
Third question. And please, answer honestly. Have you ever had sexual relations with any species considered non-human?
That happens often enough for you to have a question about it?
You'd be surprised how many wastelanders answer yes.
Joke aside though, the modding community is generally great. They're competent modders willing to improve the game as much as they can, and Fallout 4 is better because of
Since you
them.
haven't spent too much time in the wasteland, I'll assume your answer is yes.
Exceptions
to that
apply.
question.
Man, I wish I had lockpicking skills so I could see what's in the other end of that door. But I guess it will have to remain a mystery. There's so much of this game that you miss out if you don't have the right perks. A true RPG. See, there's another locked door. Who knows what mysteries lie behind it? You don't just get everything open for you need to make the right choices. It's just mind-blowing, the mystery of the game, the consequences of your build. The lack of RPG elements is also a problem in the leveling up and the way you get to build your character. This time around, special stats, skill points, and perks have all been crammed into one category. They're all perks, and there is no level cap. This may not seem like a big issue outside of the expected dumbing down of game mechanics typical for modern releases, but the problem goes a bit deeper than that. By the time I was 2/3 done with the main storyline, I had maxed out most of the combat perks and all of the crafting perks. By the time I began the DLC quests, I had tried all of the playstyles the game had to offer, and my special stats had me as an Isaac Newton, Arnold Schwarzenegger, Bruce Lee archetype. Yeah, one of those. Compare this to Skyrim, where after having completed the main storyline, all of the good guy major side quests and 2 DLCs, I only had archery, one-handed blades, and heavy armor and blacksmithing, plus some points in fire destruction magic. In other words, the second playthrough of Skyrim would allow me to take a myriad of approaches I've not tried, most notably two-handed and the schools of magic, whereas the second playthrough of Fallout 4 could not show me anything I've not already tried. There are 2 things to take away from this. First is that the apparent lack of limitation in the builds of Fallout 4 actually delimits the player's agency, and that it eliminates the necessity for tact when deciding on a build. You can build anything and experience everything. There are no consequences to making a decision. And the second thing is that Fallout 4 had shown me everything it had to show before it was finished. It is the game design equivalent of running out of things to say before you're done talking. It is almost as if the rest of the game would be uncomfortable silence interrupted by series of ahs and hmms. This is not good for any type of game, let alone one that advertises a large world and replayability. In this regard, Fallout 4 is plain bad. Although leveling up feels fun and rewarding when you start, the sense of progression lasts only up until about level 40, after which the gameplay mechanics begin to feel irrelevant due to becoming both extremely easy and increasingly stale. Pair this with a narrative that is unappealing at best, and you get a game that gives you no incentive to keep on playing. So the logical follow-up is to ask then, why keep playing? Or why bother to start playing in the first place? And that is a good question, but for all the complaints people have about the game, it still did fairly well, and for all of the flaws that are listed, I still put in close to 300 hours into it, most of which I enjoyed. So there must be something to the game that makes it appealing. The answer to that is the open world and the pacing. The game is capable of maintaining the sense of novelty for quite some time after you begin. You follow the main quest, which for all its flaws can be rather intriguing at times. Along the way you take on side quests, and you shuffle between the facets of the gameplay: combat, resource management, base building, and exploration. You get to discover more about the game world the farther you go, all the while acquiring items and companions you're likely to find interesting. This kind of mixing up of the various components of the gameplay keeps any one specific element from becoming stale, and even when they do begin to feel repetitive, this is not so bad since the repetitiveness is no worse than what you can expect from most open world products. The game's real flaws become evident only once you have leveled up enough for there to be nothing of value to see, which happens after approximately 100 hours of playtime, and after that it is a matter of slow unwinding of the good sentiment, which is supplanted not by a bad sentiment but by the hope that the good things are going to return, and to an extent they do. This depends primarily on how much of the world you have explored by this point, and that is precisely the main strength of Fallout 4. It is the open world and the exploration that keep it consistently fun and that make it engaging in the first place. There is scarcely a location in this game that does not invite exploration. The only place that does not look especially appealing is the city, and that is primarily because it is mostly great buildings and not for a lack of interesting locations, of which you will find plenty. Wherever you go in Fallout 4 there will be something that beckons you to explore. You will find more than enough content to keep you engaged, be it lore or gameplay related. Of course, some might complain that it doesn't go especially deep. I've heard Bethesda titles be described as wide as an ocean, deep as a puddle, but that's not necessarily a bad thing, unless you're describing your date. There is an appeal to having an immense open world that shows just enough to satisfy your curiosity, but not nearly enough for a doctor's thesis. There are levels of how much one is willing to invest into learning about a fictional world, and I think that Fallout 4's exploration design appeals to those who want to discover many aspects but not necessarily extensively learn about them. It is a matter of taste, and Fallout 4 errs on the side of what most people would expect to see in this kind of game. And in my opinion, it does this exceptionally well. It is consistently appealing even if not extensively thoughtful. Whereas most of the quests may be of average quality, their lack of creativity becomes a problem only after you've become too powerful to care. Prior to that, their generic writing serves as a narrative reason to explore the ruins and to partake in hostile encounters. And even after this point, if you are willing to install mods, you can extend the lifetime of the combat and consequently have the side quests resume their purpose not as flimsy stories but as convenient excuses to fight with an now modded and improved combat system. And keep in mind that criticism that applies to the majority of the side quests does not mean that all of the side quests are mediocre. There are some 20 hours worth of exceptionally well done quests, and although that is a proportionally low number compared to the full game, that is still an above average game's length worth in content that is well done and memorable, provided you do not ignore the good just to make the bad seem worse. Yes, the criticism stays. In a game as iconic as Fallout, good quests should not be the exception to the rule, and negative criticism for the overall lazy design of most quests is deserved. But pretending that Fallout 4 is an exception in this regard is absurd. The overall impression one gets from Fallout 4's questing experience will be rooted in one's perception of modern game design. It doesn't make sense to dislike Fallout 4 for its generic side quests but adore its contemporaries that also commit this crime. Fallout 4 is largely a product of its time, so its questing experience may be mediocre in total, but that is not necessarily bad. And when it does it well, it does it exceptionally well, arguably better than some or even most of its contemporaries. Now, the lack of writing may be a bit more noticeable in a Fallout game, since Fallout is largely about the game world itself, but the game world is actually well designed. Not only is it aesthetically competent, but it also works well in gameplay interactions. One of the most enjoyable things in these kinds of games are random encounters. These are the spontaneous beats of trouble or triumph that make each playthrough a unique and memorable adventure. Once I was exploring the city when I was set upon by a deathclaw. Running away from it, I got into the nearest building, which was actually a super mutant base. After cleaning it, however, I found a suit of power armor in the basement, and so was ready to confront the deathclaw outside. I would talk about them if I had more footage, but as you can see I was not recording all the game. The point is that events like these randomize the experience in a good way, and Fallout 4 achieves this standard of open world games, namely depicting to the player the sense that they are in a living, dynamic world. And so the game succeeds at world building notwithstanding its lazy writing. Take side quests and exploration and random events, and before you know it you have invested a decent sum of hours into Fallout 4, and unless you take pleasure in being a disillusioned purist, you will have had a lot of fun in the meantime. So, if you want to come to a simple conclusion out of the analysis of the gameplay itself, it would be that the mechanics themselves depend on what you're looking for in the game, because, objectively speaking, their quality is inconsistent. Some are okay, some are bad, and none are great. But the overall experience is saved by the game's pacing and its open world, which is a very competent depiction of an urban post-apocalyptic fantasy. Now, throughout the review I've mentioned mods that can repair some of the flaws of the vanilla game, so I'm going to recommend a few. This is not a complete list, nor is it a list of the only mods that serve their particular purpose. They are just the mods I've used to address several of the game's problems. The first two are mods that change nothing in the game's balancing, but instead address some basic issues that should have been taken care of by Bethesda. They did not otherwise change the vanilla game or the way it was meant to be played. The one I think everyone should install prior to playing is Full Dialogue Interface or Extended Dialogue Interface. It is pretty self-explanatory. Whichever of the two you choose, the mods address the dialogue wheels in that they let you see the full text instead of vague phrases. It will change nothing from the vanilla game other than the frustration experienced clicking ambiguous dialogue options. The other one is something for players who want to play survival mode. Now, Fallout 4 survival mode disables manual saves in the developer console. This is essentially the game annoying you into feeling as if there is more suspense to it. So unless you feel like potentially losing an hour's worth of progress just because you couldn't find a bed and had a random death or got stuck in geometry, I think it is reasonable to install any of the 3 mods you see on screen. Moving on to quote-unquote optional mods, that is mods you might want to have if you happen to get too used to the game and want to see something new, at least in the visual sense. I think the two that objectively change the visuals for the better would be True Nights and True Storms paired with Pip-Boy Flashlight. They are pretty self-explanatory and their effect on the ambient is immense. They enhance the already great atmosphere and they embellish aspects which you would otherwise not notice in the vanilla game, but once you see each mod in action you realize that this adds an additional level of style to the visual design. The pitch black night and the occasional distant light sources juxtaposed to the enshrouding darkness interact so well with the setting of a dangerous, desolate world and the narrative of hopeless pursuit for hope that, once experienced, it makes it clear just how much gaming as a medium can be legitimately described as an art form. So if you're looking for an alteration of the visuals which is minimal in scope but immense in effect, with the advantage of not being too much trouble for mid-range systems, True Nights and True Storms are the mods for you. So play a bit of the vanilla and once you feel ready for a visual change, get these two. And finally, I have somewhat of a fix for the combat once you become too powerful to actually feel threatened. These are a number of mods, chief of which, due to simplicity and effect, is the Create Your Own Difficult Rebalance mod, to alter the damage output of player and enemies. Once you put both through round 2.5 or 3.5, the combat becomes somewhat similar to the combat in Stalker or Rising Storm 2 Vietnam, in that you kill in 1 or 2 shots and you also die in 1 or 2 shots. Inventory and levels are not important, stats don't kill, bullets do. There's a caveat to this mod, and that is that the rebalancing implies certain changes to player preferences. Some of it is for the better, and some not so much. Stealth and or outright avoiding combat becomes preferable at times, scopes see more use for long-range combat, and automatic weapons are much more viable than they were in the vanilla game. These are good things. But it also has its downsides. For one, it is not a good mod if you're doing a melee build. It also flips the values in a way that big scary monsters such as the Deathclaws become big easy targets, whereas the average raider equipped with a pipe pistol is extremely lethal. So there is an absolute rebalancing in the way that threats are meant to be perceived. Worse still, it also nullifies the advantages of power armor. Now there are mods that should be able to buff the power armor, but the downside to that is that they buff it to the point where it is virtually indestructible. So I only recommend installing this mod once you become too powerful for the vanilla balancing, and only if you use firearms and wouldn't mind a scenario where the danger factor shifts from size to range. Either way, it is a mod I recommend. Approaching combat situations carefully, using cover, taking pot shots in long-range firefights, and tensely maneuvering closed-off spaces so you can shoot as soon as a threat appears are such a change in the game mechanics that I think it is almost the logical evolution to the difficulty scaling. First you fight bullet sponges, then you're the bullet sponge, and then nobody's the bullet sponge. It alters combat in a way that once you get bored from having mastered the stats become obsolete. So be careful around installing it and the time of installing it. It is best to do it only once you get to late game, so it gets a thumbs up from me, but think carefully when making the decision to install it. And of course, even if it doesn't suit your playstyle, the other mods will. The modding scene is huge. There are a lot of mods out there, including ones that add side quests as well as mods that alter the main quest. So as long as you're willing to give it a try, you're pretty much covered on every front: performance, visuals, mechanics, ambient gameplay, and even story. Much like any Bethesda RPG, modding is half the fun, so while the vanilla game and Bethesda themselves may not get a perfect score, the Nexus definitely does. Even if you're not into modding, I encourage you to try it. If you're not sure where to start, it may be a good idea to head to a channel called Qubits, which is an overall great channel if you like these types of games. So that covers modding. It is a simple process that can change a lot, and Fallout 4 being 50% game and 50% modding platform has a lot to offer, thanks to its amazing community. As the final part of this 20-minute video that is 3 times bigger than I had intended it to be are the DLCs. Fallout 4 has, I'm not counting workshops, 3 major DLCs: Automatron, Nuka World, and Far Harbor. Automatron is great. If you like the robots of the Fallout universe, you will no doubt enjoy it. It introduces a new and reasonably fun campaign, new items and locations, a charming companion, and the ability to craft robots in your settlements. The crafting is modular, so you can design them however you please, and you can either have them as protective settlers or take them along with you as companions. If it sounds like something that could be worth your time, I recommend it.
Therefore, it's better to hasten the human's death and put them out of their likely chance of misery than to deplete my limited time. It's actually quite elementary.
Unfortunately, that is not what I would say for the Nuka World DLC. It sets out to do 2 things. One is to prove that it too, like New Vegas, can introduce a desert-type, excessively hot environment, an amusement park turned wrong, and a fair deal of dark humor. The other is to remedy the good guy exclusivity of the main game by letting you join the raiders. What it achieves, however, is to prove that Bethesda cannot do what New Vegas did, and that you do not fix a flat tire by poking a hole in another one. While the new DLC location looks good and it no doubt scores high creatively and qualitatively, there is very little to it that invites the player to want to explore, especially if theme parks are not your thing. Think Dark Carnival from Left 4 Dead 2, but 2 or 3 times as long. So without a story-related mission to justify exploration, the setting gets old quickly. And the problem with sad narrative is that it forces the player into joining a raider faction, a decision which eventually carries over into the Commonwealth and has the sole survival assaulting their own settlements to retake them for the bad guys. The only way around this is to kill all of the raider bosses in a DLC location, which, albeit a fun shootout and possibly the longest combat sequence of the game, ends the entirety of the DLC's campaign about a third of the way through. So apart from a fun shootout and a couple of weapons you could probably acquire by simply modding them into the game instead, Nuka World offers nothing of value. The only way I could recommend this to someone is if they have a desire to be a raider boss, that is, a person craving for a canonized bad guy run, or alternatively someone who is seriously into amusement park settings. Finally, the Far Harbor DLC is something that I absolutely recommend. In fact, it is so good that were it a standalone expansion, I would have recommended it even to people who are uninterested in the main game. It builds in its strong points, and it addresses some of its weak points. It utilizes the science fiction nature of the setting and uses it as a foundation for a fitting plot. It elaborates on the theme of the synths. It takes the most interesting companion and builds an additional subplot around him. The Lovecraftian aesthetic is further explored. The sense of mystery is heightened. The exploration is just as fun, and side quests are more creative and offer a bit more freedom in their execution. The center point of Far Harbor's main quest is the settling of a conflict between 3 factions, which is far from black and white, and it can be tackled in several ways, wherein even the peaceful option is not entirely safe from great choices. In addition to all of that, it also builds on one of the strongest aspects of Fallout 4, and that is the ambient, which in turns up to 11. The island of Far Harbor is undoubtedly one of the most atmospherically rich locations in any Bethesda title. In fact, it may have the best ambient of all the Fallout games. It is comparable to Fallout 3's Point Lookout, except that it is more geared towards mystery and science fiction and, of course, visually much more advanced. Concerning potential caveats, it has one annoying segment in the main quest and one side quest partially ruined by the hand-holding. Other than those 2 nitpicks, this is a game worthy of your time. If you want to get only one DLC, this should be it. If you own Fallout 4 and you don't want to get any DLCs, you might want to consider changing your mind, because Far Harbor is better than the base game. Okay, so, if you like the upsides and you think you can tolerate the downsides, Fallout 4 is a game worth playing. It is a great choice if you want to experience a post-apocalyptic scenario from the comfort of a not-quite-there-yet apocalypse. It is a good game. It's not great, it has its flaws, and it is likely that the sum of its parts points to an average score. It is a product of its time, and it is likely to repel a lot of hardcore Fallout fans as well as shooter fans. If you're specifically looking for an RPG, play New Vegas first, or one of the AA titles that fit the description. If you would like a story-driven adventure, play Metro, and if you'd rather have action, check out Rage. Fallout 4 is not the go-to choice for everyone. It seems as though Bethesda didn't know if they wanted to cater to hardcore Fallout fans, Bethesda fans, the casual shooter fanbase, or some demographic that encompasses all 3. It seems they have tried to err on the latter, and it seems they have erred indeed. With that said, Fallout 4 still manages to capture the essence of what it sets out to present. A convincing post-apocalyptic world struggling to survive in the ruins of a foregone idealized era, not unlike an era many people idealize in the real world. It is attractive for its familiarity no less than it is for the strangest of its fiction. The open world is large, the ambient is spot on, and the gameplay is functional. On its own, it is a fun adventure with 2 additional adventures worth checking out, and if you're willing to mod, it can be an amazing experience. It may not be able to dethrone Skyrim as Bethesda's modern masterpiece, or impress with its novelty as a 3D RPG, as did Oblivion and Fallout 3, but for what it does, it is a solid experience, and in some sense it can be more appealing than its predecessors. And unlike a certain someone from another Bethesda title who makes a habit of reminding you that her service dues an oath and she implicitly dislikes it, the companions in Fallout 4 are volitionally nice.
Heads up. All right. Be glad to share the burden.
Take notes, Lydia. Consider this review positive, and keep in mind that the score relies heavily on Fallout's strongest sides, which are the exploration and the modding community. If it sounds like something you might like, you most likely will. And that was Fallout 4, a long, exhaustive game with a video to match. I did not foresee the length, although I think it was worth it. But I think I'll make my next few uploads smaller in scope and consequently more frequent. Although I'm sure there will be other feature-length reviews in the future, provided that the game deserves it. Thank you all for watching. And those of you who have subscribed in the meantime, know that you're all the groovier for it. I appreciate it, and I'm glad you've enjoyed my content. So stay tuned for more, stay groovy, and have a good rest of your day. Peace out.